What would you do if someone you cared for could never walk again? Would you give 10 years of your life to someone who might never even say thank you? Most people would turn away. Most people would choose the easier road. But Ella Morgan was not like most people. Her story begins not with wealth, power, or fame, but with a simple act of saying yes when the world expected her to say no. Ella was 18 when her life took a turn that no one around her could have predicted. She wasn't the kind of girl people noticed. She didn't wear bright lipstick or chase after the popular crowd. Her evenings were spent in the dim light of a small apartment, caring for her mother whose health had been slipping away for years. Books on nursing and medicine filled the corners of her room. Second-hand copies she had borrowed or bought for coins. She dreamed quietly, never daring to imagine anything grand for herself. On the other side of town, Adrian Cole's world couldn't have been more different. At 29, he was already a name people whispered about in business schools and boardrooms. A tech prodigy, a self-made billionaire, the kind of man who lived fast, spoke fast, and seemed untouchable. His face had appeared on magazine covers, his speeches flooded with confidence, his life overflowing with speed, luxury, and the thrill of never slowing down. He built an empire on risk, on daring choices that ordinary men would fear to take. And then, in one moment, all of it was taken from him. The crash happened on a night he was supposed to be celebrating a new deal. The world only saw the headlines. The next morning, billionaire tech visionary paralyzed in car accident. But what the world didn't see was the silence that followed in his hospital room. The sound of his breath shallow and angry, the way his once unshakable voice cracked when the doctors told him he would never walk again. For a man like Adrian, it wasn't just his body that broke that night, it was his pride, his identity, his will to exist. Nurses came and went. Some lasted a week, some only a few days. He was not easy to care for. His anger was sharp, his words cruel. He despised pity, despised help, despised seeing himself as weak. And so, one by one, they walked out. The man who once had an army of people waiting for his calls was now a man. No one wanted to stay near Dot. It was during this revolving door of caretakers that Ella first arrived. She was too young, the staff whispered, too soft, too quiet, too unprepared. She had no reputation, no degree, nothing impressive on paper. But she had something that no one else who came before her had. She didn't look at Adrian with fear or pity or the desperate need to fix him. She looked at him with presence, like she was there to be, not to force. The first time she entered his room, he barely looked at her. He dismissed her with a single sentence, "You won't last the week." She didn't argue. She just placed the tray of food in front of him, adjusted the pillows by his side, and left quietly. The next morning, she came back, and the morning after that, Adrian tried every way he could to push her out. He insulted her. He threw fits of silence that lasted days. He demanded things at impossible hours. But Ella didn't flinch when he threw words at her like weapons. She absorbed them and simply continued her work. When he ignored her, she spoke, softly as if she was talking to herself, filling the air with kindness instead of letting it drown in bitterness. One night, when the rain beat hard against the windows, Adrian shouted at her for the first time, with more than words he demanded she leave. He told her she was wasting her life, that he didn't want her there, that he would never get better. His voice broke, rage mixing with despair. Most people would have left in that moment, but Ella didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. "Then I'll waste my life here," she whispered. "But I won't walk away." For the first time, Adrian had no reply. He turned his head to the side, hiding the tears that burned his eyes, because he had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. And here was this girl, barely more than a child, promising to stay, not out of duty, not out of money, but out of something he didn't recognize, something he hadn't seen in a very long time. That night was the beginning of something neither of them could name. Ella didn't know if she could carry the weight of another person's pain for years, but she knew she couldn't abandon him. Adrian didn't know if he would ever trust another human being again. But for the first time since the accident, he found himself wondering what it would be like if this girl didn't leave. The world had forgotten Adrian Cole, the brilliant, unstoppable billionaire. The boardrooms had moved on, the headlines faded, but inside a quiet home at the edge of the city, a battle was beginning, not between wealth and loss, but between despair and hope. And the unlikely soldier who chose to fight it was Ella Morgan, the girl no one believed could last even a week. What neither of them knew then was that this battle would stretch on for 10 long years, that the girl who arrived as a stranger would become the reason he dared to stand again, and that their story would one day be whispered not as tragedy, but as proof that sometimes the quietest love is the strongest. The days that followed tested Ella more than she had ever imagined. At first, she thought her silence and patience might soften Adrian's anger, but the truth was, his bitterness was like a wall of stone. He had lost not only the strength of his legs, but the life he believed defined him. To him, everything beyond that loss was a shadow. He didn't believe in recovery, didn't believe in friendship, didn't even believe that kindness came without a price. Ella learned quickly that caring for him wasn't only about managing his pain or preparing his meals. It was about standing in the line of fire every day when his frustration turned into sharp words that cut deeper than he realized. Some nights she went home with her eyes burning from tears she never let him see. She would curl up beside her mother's bed and whisper promises that she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll stay. I won't give up on him. Even if he hates me, I'll stay." Adrian noticed something he didn't admit aloud. She kept showing up. No matter how cruel his voice grew, no matter how impossible he tried to make it, she returned the next day. A tray of food, a folded blanket, a book read aloud when he claimed he didn't care. She was too stubborn, he told himself, too naive to understand he was trying to protect her from wasting her life. But still, he found himself watching her when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she brushed the dust off the shelves, the way she smiled faintly when she saw the first light of morning through the window, the way she never complained even when exhaustion left her eyes heavy. There was a night that changed something between them, though neither of them admitted it. At the time, Adrian had spent hours staring at the ceiling, drowning in thoughts he could not silence. Ella had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted awkwardly, a book slipping from her hand. For a moment, the harshness inside him cracked. He realized she wasn't there because she had nowhere else to go. She was there because she chose to be, and choices like that were rarer than gold. The next morning, he didn't snap at her when she greeted him. He simply nodded. It was the smallest gesture, but Ella carried it in her heart as if it were a treasure. She understood then that somewhere beneath the bitterness, there was still a man who wanted to be seen, but progress was never steady. For every step forward, there were 2 steps back. Therapy sessions ended with slammed doors, exercises ended with shouted refusals. Adrian hated being reminded of what he couldn't do. He hated mirrors, hated doctors, hated the silence of his own house. Yet Ella stayed. She stayed when no one else would. She read articles late into the night about recovery, about nutrition, about the body's ability to rebuild itself in unexpected ways. She carried hope for him when he had none for himself. One evening, after weeks of quiet tension, Adrian finally asked her the question he had been holding back. His voice was low, almost broken. "Why are you still here? You're wasting your youth on me." Ella paused, setting down the cup of tea she had brought him. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she looked at him the way she always did, not with pity, not with fear, but with a calm steadiness that unnerved him. "Because someone has to believe in you," she whispered. "And if that someone is me, then I'll stay." The room fell silent. Adrian turned his face toward the window, but her words lingered in the air like a thread binding them together. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him that wasn't anger. It was faint, fragile, but it was hope. The months turned into years. Ella grew from a quiet girl into a woman of remarkable resilience. She learned how to lift him safely, how to manage his care with strength and precision. But she also learned the subtler art of healing, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to push him toward progress and when to simply sit beside him in the stillness of defeat. Adrian, though he fought it, began to depend on her presence in ways he could not describe. And yet, beneath every moment of calm, There was an unspoken question pressing against both of them. How long could this go on? Ella had given up college, friends, and the simple joys of youth. Adrian carried the weight of guilt for stealing her time, even as he could not let her go. The hook came one stormy night when lightning split the sky and the power flickered out. Adrian's voice, usually guarded, broke the darkness. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be if you hadn't met me?" Ella sat across from him, a candle casting a soft glow on her face. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she admitted. "But then I think, maybe I was meant to meet you. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to be." Adrian swallowed hard, his chest tightening. For the first time since the accident, he realized she wasn't just his caretaker. She was the reason he hadn't given up completely. And as the storm raged outside, Adrian Cole, once the untouchable billionaire, understood something he had never dared to believe. He was not alone. What neither of them knew was that this fragile bond, born in silence and sacrifice, would be tested in ways neither could imagine. For in the years to come, the choice Ella made to stay would not only change Adrian's life, but her own. And one day, when the world least expected it, the man who had lost everything would rise again, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the woman who refused to walk away. Asterisk years began to blur together, and with them, seasons changed outside the windows of Adrian's house. What had started as a temporary arrangement grew into something that neither Ella nor Adrian could have predicted. 10 years sounds simple when spoken aloud, but when lived, it is made up of countless mornings, endless nights, and 1,000 choices to stay when leaving would have been easier. Ella was no longer the timid girl who first stepped nervously into his room. She had grown into a woman shaped by discipline and patience, her hands steady, her voice firm when it needed to be, her heart unshaken even on the hardest days. She had sacrificed her youth, her opportunities, and at times her own happiness, but she carried no bitterness in her eyes. Instead, there was a quiet strength that came from knowing she was holding someone's world together, even if that world never fully acknowledged it. Adrian changed too, though slowly. Like a stone smoothed by water over years, his anger softened. Though he never admitted it openly, the sharp edges of his words dulled, replaced at times by silence that was no longer hostile, but reflective. He began to listen when Ella spoke. He began to notice the sound of her laughter when she allowed herself to relax, the way she hummed softly while preparing meals, the way she carried hope in her presence even when he himself could not. There were victories, small ones, that Ella celebrated even when Adrian tried to dismiss them. The day he moved his arms with more control, the day he managed to sit upright without help for longer than a few minutes, the first time he took a step in water therapy, his body trembling, his jaw clenched against pain. He called these things meaningless, but Ella held onto them like treasures, reminding him over and over that progress was progress, no matter how small. But for every step forward, there were setbacks, injuries, days when his body betrayed him and all the progress seemed erased, nights when despair returned. Like an unwelcome guest, Ella often found herself standing in the hallway, her hands pressed against her eyes, forcing back tears before walking back into his room with the same calm expression she always wore. She carried his burdens silently, unwilling to let him see how much it cost her. And still, the bond between them deepened. Adrian began to depend on her in ways he had never allowed himself to depend on anyone. He asked about her day. He noticed when she looked tired. Once, when she caught a fever and still tried to come to his side. He shocked them both by insisting she rest and refusing any help until she recovered. It was a small act of care, but to Ella, it was proof that beneath his guarded exterior, he was changing. One winter evening, after nearly a decade of routines, something unexpected happened. Adrian, who rarely spoke of the past, asked Ella to sit beside him. His voice was quiet, almost fragile, as he confessed the truth he had buried. For years, I wasn't angry at the world, he admitted. I was angry at myself. Because the man I used to be, he would never have survived this. And I hated that I couldn't be him anymore. Ella listened, her hand resting lightly on his. She didn't tell him he was wrong. She didn't offer empty promises. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe you're not supposed to be that man anymore. Maybe this version of you is meant for something greater. The words lingered in his heart long after she left the room that night. For the first time, Adrian allowed himself to wonder if there could be life beyond the shadow of who he once was. But change is never simple. The world outside had forgotten him. His company had moved on. His name faded from the magazines that once praised him. To most people, Adrian Cole was a closed chapter. Yet Ella never let him forget that the story wasn't finished. She believed, even when no one else did, that his life still carried meaning. It was during one of those long, silent nights that Adrian made a decision. He began to work in secret, pushing his body harder in therapy when Ella wasn't watching, practicing movements until exhaustion forced him to stop. Each attempt was painful, each failure a reminder of how far he still had to go. But he held on to her words, her presence, the quiet truth that someone believed in him enough to give her life to his care. And for the first time since the accident, he wanted to fight not for glory, not for revenge, but for her. Ella had no idea what he was preparing. To her, each day was simply another day to stand by him, to hold him together when he felt like falling apart. But Adrian was beginning to see further ahead, imagining a moment that had seemed impossible for so long, a moment when he might prove to her that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The hook came late one evening, when Ella was closing the curtains and Adrian's voice broke the quiet. "If I could stand again," he asked softly, "what would you do?" Ella turned, startled, unsure if he was joking, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't. She hesitated, her throat tightening. Then she whispered, "I'd finally breathe." Adrian said nothing more, but inside, a fire ignited. And though she didn't know it yet, those words became the reason he pushed harder than ever before. Because one day, Adrian Cole wanted to give Ella Morgan that breath she had been holding for 10 long years. The years had etched their marks on both of them. Ella had learned to live without asking what tomorrow would bring, carrying each day as it came, building a life around routines that others might have found suffocating, but she embraced as her purpose. Adrian had grown quieter, less consumed by rage, but beneath his calm surface lived a restless storm. He was tired of being remembered only as the man who had fallen. He was tired of being defined by what he could not do. Yet more than his own pride, he was haunted by the thought of Ella, the girl who had given away her youth, her dreams, her laughter to keep him alive in spirit as much as in body. There were nights when Adrian lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her words in his mind. "Maybe you're not supposed to be that man anymore. Maybe this version of you is meant for something greater." They echoed like a challenge, like a truth he could not ignore. For years he had let her believe. For him, now he felt something stir within, a determination that was no longer about himself, but about her. He began to push in secret. When therapists left and Ella thought he was resting, he would grip the bars until his hands burned, forcing his muscles to respond, fighting through pain that made sweat sting his eyes. He fell often, collapsing with a weight that mocked him, but each time he pulled himself up again. No one saw these battles, no one applauded, but in the silence of those late hours, Adrian Cole was remaking himself one breath at a time. That Ella sensed something changing, though she didn't know what. She noticed the way he grew quieter during their evening talks, how his eyes seemed to hold a secret. Sometimes she caught him staring at his legs, not with hatred as before, but with a strange resolve. Once, when she asked if he was in pain, he simply smiled faintly and said, "Not the kind you think." Life outside the house had moved on, but within its walls, the bond between them had grown unbreakable. They had weathered too many storms together to imagine life apart. Yet Ella never let herself dream beyond the role she had chosen. To her, she was simply his strength, his shadow, his anchor. She never dared imagine herself as anything more. One day, Adrian received news from his old company. They were hosting a grand event to celebrate its 15th anniversary, a glittering evening where the brightest names in the industry would gather. His name appeared on the guest list, though most expected he wouldn't attend. For a moment, Adrian considered declining, hiding once again from the world that had left him behind. But then he thought of Ella, of her unwavering years by his side, and something inside him whispered that maybe it was time to step into the light again. He told her about the invitation casually, expecting her to dismiss it, but instead, she surprised him. Her eyes softened, and she said, "You should go. People need to see that you're still here, that you're still Adrian Cole." Her faith cut through him like sunlight. That night, after she had gone to her room, Adrian wheeled himself back to the training bars and gripped them tighter than ever before. He had no illusions it would take a miracle to stand again, let alone walk. But miracles, he realized, were often built on the foundation of persistence. And persistence was something Ella had taught him every single day for a decade. Weeks turned into months of grueling effort. Adrian pushed his body to its limits, guided by therapists who warned him not to expect too much. "You may never regain more than this," one said gently, as he trembled through another attempt. But Adrian shook his head, whispering words no one else heard. "I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for her." Ella noticed the small improvements without understanding the hours behind them. The way his grip grew stronger, the way he shifted his weight with more stability. She smiled at these changes, encouraging him, never, knowing that he was preparing for something far greater than she dared to dream. There came a night when exhaustion threatened to break him. His body gave out, and he fell hard to the floor, pain shooting through him until his vision blurred. For a long moment, he lay there, the taste of failure bitter in his mouth. He almost called for Ella, almost admitted defeat. But then he thought of her words years ago, "If I could stand again, what would you do?" And her answer, whispered with trembling honesty, "I'd finally breathe." With a guttural cry, Adrian dragged himself back to the bars, pulled himself upright, and forced his legs to respond. They trembled violently, threatening to collapse, but he stood. Only for a second, only long enough to know it was possible. And in that second, he realized the fight was not hopeless. The hook came quietly, not in triumph, but in his resolve. That night, Adrian made a promise to himself. He would walk again, not to reclaim his empire, not to prove the world wrong, but so that on the day that truly mattered, he could give Ella the one gift she had waited 10 years for, the sight of him standing before her. And as he closed his eyes, his body trembling with pain, but his heart burning with determination, Adrian whispered into the silence of the room, "Wait for me, just a little longer." Ella, asleep down the hall, never heard the words. But she would. One day, she would. The evening of the anniversary arrived like a storm Ella hadn't seen coming. She had insisted on helping Adrian prepare, brushing the creases out of his suit, adjusting the tie he had not worn in nearly a decade. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked, not because she doubted him, but because this was the first time in years he had agreed to be seen by the world again. "You look." She paused, searching for the right word, her throat tight. "You look like yourself again." Adrian gave her a half-smile, though he said nothing. Inside, his chest burned with anticipation and fear. For months he had been working in silence, carrying the secret of his progress like a flame too fragile to show. Tonight, that flame would be revealed, and he wasn't sure if it would burn brightly or be extinguished. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers and murmurs of wealth, laughter, spilling across polished marble floors. As Adrian entered in his chair with Ella at his side, heads turned, conversations stopped. For many, the sight of him was like seeing a ghost of a man they once admired. Some eyes softened with pity, others sharpened with curiosity, but none of it mattered. Adrian's gaze was fixed forward, steady, determined. Ella walked beside him with quiet grace, her presence shielding him from the weight of so many stares. To her, he wasn't the fallen billionaire or the spectacle everyone whispered about. He was simply Adrian, the man she had fought for every day, the man she had chosen to stand beside. The speeches began, a celebration of achievements, of legacies, of futures built on the foundation Adrian himself had once laid. His name was spoken with reverence, but always in the past tense, as though he had already been buried in history. Ella felt a pang in her chest at the way they spoke of him, as if the fire of who he was had gone out forever. She wanted to shout that they were wrong, that he was still here, still alive, still burning with more strength than they could ever imagine. And then when the moment came, Adrian surprised them all. His name was called to the stage not as a speaker, but as a guest of honor, a relic of the company's early days. The crowd expected a polite wave from his chair, perhaps a few words spoken from where he sat. But Adrian had not fought for 10 years to remain seated. He glanced at Ella, who gave him an encouraging smile, unaware of what he was about to do. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might break his chest. Then, slowly, with effort that made every muscle tremble, Adrian placed his hands on the arms of his chair and began to rise. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. The chandelier seemed to flicker as silence fell heavy across the room. Adrian's body shook. His legs, uncertain, his grip white-knuckled on the cane he pulled to his side. Every step was a battle, but he took it anyway. One step, then another. The sound of the cane echoed like thunder in the stillness. Ella froze, her breath stolen from her lungs. For years she had dreamed of this moment, but seeing it with her own eyes felt impossible, like watching a miracle unfold in real time. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears welled, threatening to spill. She wanted to run to him, to steady him, but something inside told her not to move, not to rob him of the power of this moment. Adrian reached the center of the stage, standing taller than he had in a decade. His face was pale, his body weak, but his eyes blazed with life. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the cameras, at the crowd that had long ago buried him in their memories. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't directed at them. It was directed at her. "I spent 10 years learning how to stand again," he began. His voice steady despite the tremor in his body. But it wasn't for pride. It wasn't for revenge. It wasn't even for myself. He turned his gaze toward Ella, his eyes locking on hers across the room. It was for the woman who stayed when everyone else left. The woman who gave her youth, her strength, her heart without asking for anything in return. "Tonight, I don't stand for my legacy. I stand for her." A stunned silence held the crowd captive. Then, almost as if the room itself exhaled, murmurs turned into applause, applause turned into cheers. But Ella heard none of it. Her world narrowed to the man on stage, the man who had been broken and rebuilt, who had chosen her as the reason to rise. Tears streamed freely down her face as Adrian extended a trembling hand in her direction. She moved forward slowly at first, then with urgency, weaving through the crowd until she reached him. Their hands met, his warm and shaking, hers wet with tears. For a moment, nothing else existed. No applause, no flashing lights, no whispers of disbelief. Just two souls who had weathered 10 years of storms finally standing in the same light. The hook was not in his triumph, but in his words, which would echo in every heart that heard them. Sometimes the greatest strength is not found in wealth or power or success. Sometimes the greatest strength is found in the love that refuses to let go. And though Adrian still leaned on his cane, though his steps were few and fragile, in that moment he had never stood taller. And Ella, the girl who once walked into his life unnoticed, was seen at last for what she truly was, the reason he rose again. The night of the anniversary became a turning point not only for Adrian and Ella, but for everyone who witnessed it. Videos of him standing spread quickly, clips of his trembling but determined steps flooding across the internet within hours. To the world, it was a miracle. To those who knew his story, it was perseverance made flesh. But to Ella, it was something even deeper. It was the fulfillment of a promise she had never known. He made the proof that her years of sacrifice had not been in vain. That the days after the event were overwhelming. Messages poured in, reporters demanded interviews, and invitations arrived from foundations, universities, and even world leaders who wanted Adrian to speak. Yet through it all, Adrian remained quiet, his focus never drifting far from Ella. To the world, he had returned. To himself, he knew he had been reborn not as the man he once was, but as a man shaped by pain, patience, and the unwavering love of a woman who had refused to let go. Ella struggled with the attention. She had never wanted the spotlight. For 10 years, her world had been defined by quiet halls, whispered encouragements, and the steady rhythm of devotion. Now, strangers called her a hero, though she never saw herself as one. When asked how she endured, she would simply smile and say, "I didn't endure. I chose. Adrian, however, saw an opportunity in the newfound attention. He had once built an empire of technology, but now he wanted to build something far greater. Together with Ella, he began funding rehabilitation centers, programs for the disabled, and scholarships for caregivers who gave their lives in service of others. He named the first center not after himself, but after her. The Ella Morgan Foundation for Hope became a beacon for countless families who had once believed their battles were theirs alone. But for all the grand projects and noble efforts, what mattered most were the quiet moments, the way Adrian would still struggle each morning to strengthen his steps, the way Ella still offered her steady hand when he faltered. Their life together was not perfect. There were setbacks, days when his body betrayed him, nights when old fears returned. Yet now they faced them side by side, not as caretaker and patient, but as two souls bound by a story that defied despair. One autumn afternoon, much like the day she had first walked into his room all those years ago, Adrian and Ella stood in the garden of the rehabilitation center. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the wind. Adrian leaned on his cane, his steps slow but steady. As Ella walked beside him, he glanced at her with that familiar, quiet fire in his eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice almost hesitant. "The 10 years you gave me?" Ella stopped, turning to him with a look that silenced his doubts. "I didn't give you 10 years," she said softly. "I lived them with you. And if I had to choose again, I would." Adrian swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He knew then that no speech, no applause, no building with their names engraved could ever capture the truth of what she had given him. Her gift was not time. It was life itself, the will to rise, to hope, to love again. Later that evening, Adrian stood before a crowd at the opening of their first foundation. Ella sat in the front row, her eyes shining. His voice carried across the room with the weight of a man who had known both triumph and despair. "People call me strong because I learned to walk again," he said. "But the truth is, strength isn't found in muscles or money or power. Strength is found in the love that stays when the world turns away. I am standing here not because I fought alone, but because one woman chose not to let me fall." The audience erupted in applause. But once again, Adrian's gaze was fixed on Ella. She lowered her head, overcome, because she had never sought recognition. Yet in that moment, she understood that their story had become more than theirs. It belonged now to everyone who had ever felt hopeless, everyone who had ever been told it was impossible, everyone who needed proof that faith and love could move mountains. And still, the greatest moments were the simplest ones. Walking together in the garden, sharing quiet dinners, sitting on the porch during long summer evenings when the sky turned gold. For all the world's attention, they remained, at their core, to people who had endured the fire of 10 years and emerged not burned, but forged. The hook was not in the applause of crowds or the flash of cameras, but in the truth whispered in the stillness of their lives. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not the ones the world sees, but the ones fought in silence day after day, until love itself becomes the miracle. Their story would be told for years to come, in classrooms and homes, in hospitals and churches. But for Adrian and Ella, it was never about being remembered. It was about living each day with gratitude for the second chance they had been given. A man who once believed he had lost everything discovered that what he gained was greater than all the wealth in the world. A girl who once walked into his life unnoticed became the reason he stood again. And so, as the sun set on another ordinary day in their extraordinary journey, Adrian leaned gently on his cane, turned to Ella, and whispered, "I spent 10 years learning to stand. Now, with you, I'll spend the rest of my life learning to live." Ella smiled, her eyes shining with quiet tears, and for the first time in years, she let herself truly breathe.